This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, Zach Charbonnet.
What's up, everyone? It's Zach Charbonnet, and this is episode 762 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I'm sure a lot of you have finished some rookie drafts already, and hopefully you were able to use my post-draft rankings to help. On today's episode, I'm going to talk through some of those rankings to see how things changed pre to post-draft. And I'll focus on single quarterback leagues with some random superflex thoughts thrown in there. This information isn't necessarily new because you could get it in the prospect guide or on the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. But some of the analysis and the logic behind the rankings, that might be new. I see this as a necessary exercise to sort of move past draft season and shift our minds into redraft mode. And of course, if you haven't checked out the Late Round Prospect Guide, you should. You can head to lateround.com to get it. It includes a longer rankings list than the one that you'll hear on today's show, and it also has a breakdown of what goes into my prospect models, and it profiles every running back and wide receiver who are at this year's combine. And then it also has a section on my year 2 model, which includes profiles for relevant second-year players in the NFL. That's the Late Round Prospect Guide. But guess what? Since NFL draft season is coming to an end, that means fantasy football drafts are getting closer, which means it's time for the Late Round Draft Guide. Last year's Fantasy Sports Writers Association Publication of the Year is now available for pre-order over on lateround.com for just $19.99. It gives you everything that you need to dominate your season-long drafts this year. It'll launch at the end of June, and that's when the price will rise by $5. So you can pre-order that right now for $19.99. There's a lot happening with Late Round Fantasy Football. Check it all out on lateround.com. Now let's talk about these rankings. Bijan Robinson is my 101 in rookie drafts. That has not changed. Whether you're in superflex leagues, whether you're in single quarterback leagues, it's Bijan Robinson. I've said enough about him as a prospect in the past. So let's just focus on this landing spot of Atlanta. It's hard to really be mad at it. The Falcons had the 4th lowest pass rate since 2011 last season, and that's despite having a losing record. Their pass rate when games were within 6 points, or neutral game scripts, was 6th lowest since 2011. They want to run the football. And we can say what we want about Arthur Smith, but they were effective running the ball last year. Tyler Algier was 6th best in the league last year in yards after contact per attempt. That's according to Pro Football Focus. Caleb Huntley ranked 10th. Cordero Patterson was top 30. And all 3 of those running backs were top 15 in number fire success rate metric. That measures the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back. So you could definitely argue that the Falcons didn't need Bijan Robinson to have a good run game. But this is fantasy football. I don't care about all that. Robinson is going to be a workhorse back in a run-heavy offense, all while being able to capture a pretty big target share because the competition at pass catcher is lacking. It's not very deep. They have Kyle Pitts, Drake London, and not much else. Right now for 2023, my projections have Robinson at RB5. But I think there's a very easy argument to make that he could be the RB2 in fantasy football from a rankings perspective behind Christian McCaffrey. We're worried about the long term with Dynasty, sure. But that just goes to show how good things are looking for Bijan Robinson right now. He's a near 99th percentile player in my prospect model. Players ranked that high have insane hit rates. Robinson is your 101. If you were to tell me before the draft that I'd have Jahmyr Gibbs as my 102 in rookie drafts, I wouldn't be that surprised. I'd probably assume that Jaxon Smith-Njigba fell in the draft, and that he fell to a pretty annoying landing spot. But if you were to tell me that I'd have Gibbs in a tier of his own, I would have been surprised. But that's where we're at. I won't reiterate the things that I've been saying about Gibbs on the show for the last 2 weeks. I think the best breakdown I can give you guys happened on episode 760. But I do think re-emphasizing the draft capital point is important here. Draft capital is an input in my model because it matters. Pre-draft, Gibbs was expected to go maybe in the late 1st, early 2nd round. When you look at him there, and you look at his profile there and compare it to backs who have gone in that range historically, it's a little bit frightening. You get comps like Giovanni Bernard. These smaller backs who were solid in the NFL, but they lack the volume that we want in fantasy football. Largely because of their size. And size does matter. I did studies on this over the offseason. You can check one of them out over on lateround.com in the newsletter archive. But the difference with Gibbs going 12th overall versus 32nd overall is massive. Not just because he gets a much nicer score in my trusty prospect model, but because he becomes a pretty clear outlier. He's now more like Christian McCaffrey, who has the second best prospect score in that model, than he is Giovanni Bernard. McCaffrey was a better prospect than Gibbs, don't get me wrong. But the association should make you feel better about Jahmyr Gibbs. Gibbs' value in Dynasty should appreciate well year over year. I think he's the clear 102 in this class now, and I'd confidently take him ahead of all the wide receivers. I then have Jaxon Smith-Njigba in his own tier after Gibbs. He came in with the best prospect score at wide receiver in my model, and I do have him in his own tier as a result. So 3 tiers so far with 3 players. That's not a normal thing to happen. Now, this isn't the best landing spot for JSN. No one should be selling it that way. The Seahawks already have DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, and they're willing to be a balanced team. They're not necessarily projected to have some insane pass rate like the Chiefs. That's all a problem. I would expect the Seahawks to run a lot more 11 personnel now that they have JSN. They haven't had a good third wide receiver. Their offensive coordinator, Shane Waldron, is from the Sean McVay coaching tree. And McVay loves himself some 3 wide sets. The problem that JSN could face in year 1 is that Tyler Lockett could still play ahead of him. Which means JSN, at least to start the year, may not be as full-time of a player as we'd want him to be. We know he can dominate in the slot, and I'd assume that we see them move their wideouts around the formation. But it's not like Tyler Lockett is Nico Collins. Nothing against Nico Collins, it's just that Tyler Lockett is really good. Now, Lockett's possibly gone in 2024, though I don't necessarily expect that to happen. He's at least going to be 31 this year and 32 next year, though. So JSN has a good shot to overtake him either this season or into next season, as long as the talent is there, and we think the talent is there. And that's what you have to remind yourself of here. JSN to me is the best wide receiver talent in this class. He's going to win like Keenan Allen at the NFL level, or that's what we hope. And there's a chance that where he wins and how he wins translate to the highest target share on that team as soon as 2024. I'd highly doubt that that happens this year. But with Lockett getting older and DK Metcalf seeing more down the field targets and red zone looks, those higher valued looks in fantasy, JSN could beat him in target share as a second-year player. I definitely think that's in his range of outcomes. So I wouldn't overthink this landing spot too much. If a wide receiver can ball out, he's going to ball out. It could have been a spot where JSN could see more obvious work, but you're buying the talent here above anything else. Now things start to get a little bit more interesting after JSN. I think Jordan Addison is next. Before the draft, I talked about Addison's perfect landing spot being Minnesota, and that's exactly where he got drafted. And it's still perfect. He doesn't have to be the alpha in that offense, and the Vikings can line him up in the slot while getting him some work on the perimeter too. At his size, he's probably going to take advantage of the slot most in the NFL. Not only that, but he was far more productive at Pitt than at USC. And at Pitt, he lined up in the slot about 3 times as often as he did at USC. I think Addison's an easy candidate to be the best rookie wide receiver in fantasy football this year. The Vikings aren't very deep at pass catcher. He could walk in and see up to a 20% target share in that offense pretty easily. And it's an offense that ranked 4th highest in neutral script pass rate last year, which was Kevin O'Connell's first and only year as head coach. Addison also had the second best score in my prospect model at wide receiver, so slotting him here makes sense from that perspective too. But in this same tier, I do have Quentin Johnson and Zay Flowers. And I'm going to go with the model by putting QJ behind Addison, and then I've got Flowers after that. Quentin Johnson has a much better projection for this season than Flowers does. Not that I'm telling you to just fade Flowers, but the Chargers offense projects to be much more pass-heavy than the Ravens, even though the Ravens will be more pass-heavy this year without Greg Roman in the picture. But as we know, Mike Williams hasn't been able to stay healthy, and both him and Keenan Allen are getting up there in age. Pairing Johnston with Justin Herbert could bring some fireworks given his yards after the catch ability and his ability to get down the field. That's something that the Chargers have desperately been needing. I think Johnson's a more volatile prospect than Flowers, though. But I'm still a believer in Rashad Bateman, who's Flowers' teammate now, because Bateman had one of the best yards per route run rates in football last year. I think Johnston is set up better for year 1. And yes, this is Dynasty. We care more than just about the first year of these guys' career. But the thing is, we want these players to get better in value year over year. I see that happening more for Quentin Johnston than Zay Flowers. The opportunity is there at least. There are more outs for him given his situation. And he also had a slightly better prospect score. If you want to go Flowers, though, be my guest. I tier these players for a reason. All of these guys are relatively interchangeable in rank. But I would favor going in this order. Now, my fifth tier consists of 4 players. And honestly, it's gotten to the point where I'm just trying to get exposure to each of these guys in different rookie drafts. I'm not overweight on any of them, but I haven't faded any of them either. Anthony Richardson is part of this group in single quarterback leagues. If we're talking Superflex, I think Richardson is your number 2 overall player. He's the guy who has a chance to break fantasy football. And everyone's sitting there concerned about his floor. But if he's starting, his floor is better than anyone else's in this class at quarterback. With mobile and athletic quarterbacks, the floor is not the problem. It's the ceiling. They need good passing numbers to be a true difference maker. Richardson is now a pretty safe bet because he went in the top 5, even for his rookie season. If you look back to 2011 at the quarterbacks who had top 15 draft capital and simply ran the ball 5 or more times per game as a rookie, it's a pretty freaking good list. You get Justin Fields, Deshaun Watson, RG3, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, and Cam Newton. Fields was the worst of that group year 1. He averaged about 11 standard fantasy points per game. But Deshaun Watson was at 24 during his limited time. RG3 was at 21. Kyler Murray and Josh Allen were above 17 points per game. And if you remember, Cam Newton was a beast his rookie year, averaging over 23 standard fantasy points per game. Richardson comes out as my QB 12 in my early projections. And that should give you some confidence in him being the QB 1 in Dynasty from this class. We haven't really seen a quarterback like him before. He could really wreck fantasy football. Now, if you'd rather not go the quarterback route, which I totally understand, you could also go with either Zach Charbonnet or Devon Achane. One of those guys I expected to be in this tier post-draft. One of them I definitely did not. Now, if you want my detailed thoughts on Charbonnet, I think last week covers that. I talked about him on the post-draft show, and then I broke down that situation in Seattle in the mailbag episode too. Long story short, Charbonnet does things that Kenneth Walker doesn't do well. Or at least we're hoping that Charbonnet can, based on what he did in college. I've seen Charbonnet drop a lot in rookie drafts. I got him at the 204 spot in a Superflex draft last week. I think it's almost weighing landing spot too much. Because at the very least, Charbonnet is a handcuff. We'd all agree there. But then you layer on the draft capital and what he brings to the table, and it's easy to see that he's probably going to get some work in that offense, whether on the ground at times to help Kenneth Walker or through the air, and possibly even goal line work. So there's going to be some flex appeal for Charbonnet from a median outcome standpoint. And then there's the possible upside of a Kenneth Walker injury. If Kenneth Walker weren't in the picture at all, Charbonnet would be a top 3 or 4 single quarterback rookie pick. Charbonnet can still step into that role with a Walker injury or just a 1-week injury. It doesn't have to be a season-long one. Running backs get hurt. This is just what happens. So he can be sort of this flex player with upside. That's as long as you like the talent, you like Charbonnet the player, and you believe in him. I don't think there's anything wrong with that kind of player in this range. Because Devon Achane, he has some question marks too. I did not expect to have Achane ranked in this tier before the draft started. But he fell into the literal one spot where his size may not matter as much as it typically would. Now, I want to be clear here, because I think this is misunderstood a lot. The running back size thing isn't necessarily about ability. It's a trend based on what coaches do. We don't see running backs this size get a ton of work. Since 2011 and maybe even beyond, I just looked back to 2011, we haven't seen a single running back below 190 pounds get to 100 carries in a single season. With that being said, Achane has a real shot to do that. And I don't think this is just me betting on some outlier. Not only is his prospect profile just better than basically any of those smaller backs, but this outside zone scheme is perfect for his speed. We've seen that in this same offense with Raheem Mostert and with Elijah Mitchell back in San Francisco. And Mostert last year even. Both of those guys are not huge backs. Mostert was 195 pounds coming out. Now, I don't think Achane is likely to be an RB1 in fantasy football. But an RB2? That's definitely in his range of outcomes. Even on limited touches. Because this is an offense where he can be unbelievably efficient. There's so much speed everywhere. And honestly, this is a little bit subjective, but Mike McDaniel strikes me as a coach who isn't going to limit a player's touches just because of what a scale says. So if you'd like to go with Devon Achane at the top of this tier, I can totally understand that. And the same goes for Dalton Kincaid, the last guy in this tier. I sent a newsletter about this last week, but Kincaid was not the top tight end in my new prospect model. Sam Laporta was. But there's a big caveat here. That was only because Kincaid didn't have testing numbers. So things got thrown off a little bit. If you assume that he'd get to the 105 speed score mark, he was definitely the tight end 1 in this class. In fact, if you make that assumption, he'd be the third best prospect that the model has seen behind only Kyle Pitts and Dallas Goedert. This dates back to 2015. The model really loved Dallas Goedert. And right below him is Mark Andrews and George Kittle, for real. We know tight ends don't appreciate all that well in value compared to running backs and wide receivers. But Kincaid could easily be an exception to that rule. If you want to draft him over the others in this tier, that makes total sense. If you're in a tight end premium league or one where more than one tight end is being started, you can draft him even higher. I don't expect him to be a traditional tight end in Buffalo. He's going to get a lot of slot work too. Now, I don't think there's a lot of surprises with my rankings. Up until this point, they're fairly chalky. But that's sort of how things played out this year. After that group of players, things get really, really interesting. In single quarterback leagues, you could look at Bryce Young or CJ Stroud. And I think there's a pretty big tier after that Kincaid tier that includes those quarterbacks along with some of the round 2 wide receivers like Jaden Reed, Jonathan Mingo, Marvin Mims. And Kendre Miller is part of that tier for me too, as is Sam Laporta, who I think is the better prospect compared to Michael Mayer. I would rather have Laporta than Mayer straight up. Now, I've talked about a lot of those players over the last handful of weeks, so I won't dig super deep. You can get their profiles and how I'm thinking about them in the prospect guide, or just ask me on a mailbag episode. But that's where I'm at about a round and a half through single quarterback drafts. I think it's going to end up being a pretty wild year for rookies, and I'm here for it. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Remember to check out the prospect and the draft guide over on lateround.com. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later this week with the mailbag episode.